How did you get into journalism from reading fiction?
I grew up in a time when the first Gulf War was happening, and growing up in Lahran, I was very young at the time, but I remember the times where the bombs would drop and we would feel the earth shake. And I remember seeing like things in the sky, and I remember my mom trying to not make us afraid. She would say something like, Fourth of July, you know how there's fireworks? Those bombs, that's firework. I knew she was lying to me or trying to create sort of a fictional world for us to be more safe. But I also knew that I liked her sense of kind of adventure in this whole thing. And so I knew very early on that I wanted to be a journalist.
Jasmine Bager, thank you so much for coming on Hazawi. Really appreciate you being here. Given the fact that you are on vacation and you have a friend who gave birth today and you want to go say Mabruk to.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I want to start just because you had the background of growing up in Saudi Arabia, and to ask you, when you hear the word Hazawi, what comes to mind?
Your podcast.
So I'll tell you where the name originated from. So I grew up in Yemen, and in Yemen, electricity goes out often. And when I was a kid, my cousins and I would sit around my mom during electric outages, and she would tell us Hazawi or stories. And those stories were in the form of fiction most of the time, and they were of characters that were supernatural, of animals or humans, and they kind of mirrored the hero's journey. So they had something that they wanted, there were obstacles, and that they went after it, and at the end they got what they wanted. So that's where that name comes from, and I was wondering if you had that same sort of image in your mind of the word Hazawi.
I actually really love that story, and it just proves that your mom is the light among the darkness.
Thank you. You have a very interesting backstory, and I wanted you to give a snapshot of your childhood, your teen years, and the sort of experiences that shaped the person that you are today.
Okay, so let's start from the very beginning. I was born to a multicultural household. My mom is Cuban, my father is Saudi, and I grew up in Dhahran in Sharqiya in Saudi Arabia. So growing up, I always was a writer. I always had a notebook with me. And I had crayons before I knew how to write words. And I was always scribbling. And I was always that child that was very curious about everything. And I was a very well behaved child. So I would sit with the adults and listen to all of their stories. Then I would go to the kids section, like with my cousins and my siblings, and then I would tell them what the adults were saying. I was kind of like being a correspondent or a reporter already. And then I would go from the kids' side and go to the adults, and then I would tell them what they're doing. So I was always that kind of person. And my mom didn't speak Arabic growing up. And I went to a Saudi school, an Arabic school. So I was the original translator. I had to translate everything. And so, very, very young, I felt like I was a foreign correspondent almost. My entire childhood was me taking complex things, translating it in bite sized kind of little bits and giving it to the audience. And that was always just something natural in my personality. It was something that I was very much kind of, I don't know if it was something that I would have chosen myself, but it's something that I was kind of, it was naturally happening to me. So I decided to be smart when it was time to decide on what to study for college. And I decided to be a writer, journalist. So that's what I did. I studied that for undergrad, and I went to the US for that. I graduated from Saudi, and I went to Florida, and I studied double major in journalism and studio art because I wanted to be an arts journalist. From the very beginning, I wanted to focus on art and culture, especially in Saudi. We didn't really have a lot of reporters that talked about art and culture as a way, like a soft power. And I felt that was something that I was always attracted to when I was very young. I would always go whenever I'd travel, and I would buy books and magazines, and I would read the art and culture kind of pages. And I read a lot of things that were very artistic. I was a very creative kid. And there wasn't a lot of that. So I decided to fill the gap. And when I started to study, I studied something that I felt I needed. So one of the audience members, whenever I write anything or do anything is the young girl that I used to be. So that's one of my audiences. Like, I want to create something that I would have wanted to read when I was young.
That's amazing. I can take this in so many different ways. I want to take a step
Go for it.
even uh, back a little bit. How did your parents meet? I mean, it's such a fascinating story that you have. But then I mean, stereotypically, you wouldn't think Saudi would marry anyone outside maybe their village. I mean, it's the same thing with the Yemenis. We are very like traditional. We keep to our families. How did they meet?
Well, that's their story, not mine. You'd have to ask them.
um,
But yeah, no, for me, like it's definitely very much ingrained in how I became a better journalist because of the background that I had. Both of my parents were born in countries, lived and were raised in a different country, and so both my parents were third culture kids. So my dad did not grow up in Saudi, even though he was born in Saudi. He grew up somewhere else, and he came back as an adult. My mom was born in Cuba. She went and lived in a different country, which is the US. And then they got married and they lived in Saudi. So it was always in my mind. I'm always thinking about stories that have been neglected and forgotten, the stories between the lines. And I always was attracted to anyone who um, needed something to make them feel more like they were part of the community. So I always would think about that as part of my audience as well.
And growing up, did you visit the U.S. or did you stay in Saudi the whole time? I'm just thinking about your transition and how did it happen when you came for college?
Yeah, so I used to visit. It was once a year, like during the summer, not every single summer. Sometimes we would visit my other grandmother. So we would rotate. So I didn't always come to the US, but I was a very fluent English speaker very early on. I was an avid reader. I loved reading. And I actually wrote an essay about this some years ago for a publication where I used to get in trouble at school because I used to have English books in between my Arabic books and I would read them and my teacher would see it and I'd get in so much trouble. So I was always very, very much a self starter with that. I loved reading. And so that was something that was easy for me. Once I got to the US in college, I remember I wanted to go with the classes with the students that for English for second language or whatever it was, but my they said no. They said I was fluent enough that I'll thank them later. And you know what? They were right. I cried the first semester at college. I was like, no, I want to go with the other kids. I didn't really want to go with the American kids that were speaking very, very fast. So I'll tell you what I used to do. I used to take like a shampoo bottle, this is a true story. And I would sit there and I'd read all the ingredients from top to bottom and I'd go all the way down and then I'd read it again so I can read it really, really fast. So that's how I got to speaking really fast. And I realized that's how Americans speak and that's how it can fit in.
Oh my God, you were on it from the get go. I'm wondering if you remember or if any of the books that you were reading covered by the English books that you were reading covered by the Arabic books stand out for you in terms of memory.
Oh, I read a lot of thrillers and a lot of kind of Stephen King was a huge, huge influenced. I think if you read some of my early writings, there was a lot of a lot of imitation. I would have to say in the beginning, I didn't have my own style at that time, so I just wrote a lot of R.L. Stine. I don't know if you're familiar, but R.L. Stine, Stephen King. These are all authors that I was just very much attracted to their style of storytelling because they wanted you. I mean, speaking about your earlier story with your mom, um, these are all stories that were kind of from the mythical kind of world, and it just made me escape a little bit. Growing up in Saudi, it was very restricted at the time, and as a woman, we weren't allowed a lot of the kind of freedoms that we are privileged to have now. So at that time, what I would do is I would travel through the pages of a book. So we would just flip a page and I would escape into that world. And since we didn't have freedom of movement, I was able to move through those pages and I was able to escape into worlds that were created. And I felt very safe in those environments. And I was very, very much attracted to thrillers and things that were a little bit more exciting. And I really wasn't into rom coms and any of that type. Even in movies, I prefer dramas. So I don't know what that says about me, but that was something that was attractive to me at the time.
So how did you get into journalism from reading fiction?
So I'll tell you, I mean, fact is much stranger than fiction. I grew up in a time when the first Gulf War was happening, and growing up in Lahran, you know, I was very young at the time, but I remember, I remember this. I remember the times where the bombs would drop and we would feel the earth shake. And I remember seeing like things in the sky, and I remember my mom trying to not make us afraid. She would say something like, you know, 4th of July, you know how there's fireworks? Those bombs, that's fireworks. And I remember I knew she was lying to me or trying to create a sort of a fictional world for us to be more safe. But I also knew that I liked her sense of kind of adventure in this whole thing. And so I knew very early on that I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to, like I said earlier, when I would go to places in Saudi and I would have to translate things to my mother, it was something that I was very attracted to, kind of telling the truth and conveying that to others that maybe won't understand it fully. And so that was something that I always was attracted to. I wrote about this actually for my admission essay for grad school. The story of what during the Gulf War, and how I was so touched by how everyone stopped and everyone was watching the TV. And at that time, you know, there was the first time that we had 24 hours on TV, like the news, and they were listening to a journalist talk. And the journalists were so important in our household. Like the newspaper, when it would come in, everyone opened it and would read, you know, through it. And it was just something that I, from a very young age, remember the sound of the newspaper being opened. You know, it just felt like little, you know, paper birds, and it was just something to me that just caught my attention and my imagination. And I knew that I wanted to be someone important like that, and not me necessarily, but the work to be important and the story to be the center.
That's amazing. Something that stood out to me that you mentioned earlier when you first started, you talked about how you started by imitating Stephen King and the books that you were reading before developing your own style. Can you walk me through how that imitation became, or how was your style born from the imitation?
Yes, absolutely. So undergrad, when I was in Florida, I went to an art school. So I studied journalism and art. It was a double major, and art school really helped me see. I know it sounds cliche, but it really helped me see. And art school is great because it creates an atmosphere that's safe, where you can create something, you can put colors on a canvas, and you have to put it on the wall and you have to talk about it to your class. And sometimes in the beginning, I'd be a little embarrassed and I wouldn't really know what to say. But at some point, you start to build the confidence and you start to talk about what you're seeing. And it was really important because other people would critique your work and they would talk about it as well, and the framing of it. And recognize very early on that what people are seeing is what you're conveying. So it's very much like this artistic expression that I was able to kind of put onto that canvas. Or when I was taking a photography class, for example, whatever was in the frame, that little frame, you know, the viewfinder, when you're taking that image, you have to crop out things. And so to me, that's similar to any kind of storytelling. You're editing out things and you're just focusing on one specific aspect of it and zooming in on that. And for me, that helped me develop my style. And I was able to do that. And if you read a lot of my work, even though it's journalism, it's very artistic in the way that I try to bring you in with me. So you're walking with me. I describe how something smells. I describe how something feels. And it's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. I have had some copy editors tell me, oh, it's too creative, it's too artistic, or whatever else. But for me, that's my style. I like to kind of create a sense where you feel something, at least in the lead. And it's something that my kind of art school kind of prep seeps into my journalistic work even today.
This is a deeper question in the same category. How do you find your style? You found it through art school, and that helped you see, and I can see how that process can unveil. How would
Mhm.
someone, a beginner writer, a journalist or not, can find their style?
That's something that you have to experiment with. I don't think there's a one size fits all. There's no formula to that. Writing is very personal, and it is important for you to stay curious. The things that you're attracted to are things that you should kind of spend your time reading. For example, books or magazines or any kind of publication that you're attracted to for one reason or another, and try to identify what is it that's attractive to you about this style, and then figure out what you want to write. Like I was telling you earlier, one of the audience members for me is the little girl that I used to be. So for me, when I'm writing these things, it's something that I wanted when I was young and I didn't have. So I'm creating what is missing from, you know, cyberspace.
The question about audience is a very important one for writers. I write mostly fiction, and I don't necessarily, I mean, I'm not published. There's not a lot of pressure on my back. I just write. By when you write to the little girl. Who else do you imagine when you are writing in terms of audience?
So right now I'm a staff writer at a publication, and so I write for the local desk. So the things that I write, it's very much um, kind of limited to a geography, and so for me, it's actually a nice challenge because I have always my career has been not in a straight line. I've gone many different places and I've lived in different countries and things like that. So for now, I'm focused on one geography. And to me, it's actually a nice way for me to stay within a certain parameter. And so that's my audience right now. But I think, yeah, I mean, anyone who is interested in art and culture pieces, although I'm writing about different topics as well. So I wrote a piece, like a finance piece, that's going to be published soon. Um, so yeah, it's different things, whatever I'm interested in.
And how do you fit your style? Because you've written for many publications and news outlets. And how do you fit your style or change up the tone for the voices of the publication?
So one of the most important things is, they say it, and I think it can't be stressed enough. You have to read the publication that you're writing for. So you have to kind of make sure that you stay within some sort of parameter, like, either word count or style or anything like that. For me, if you read my pieces, doesn't matter what topic it is. I'm very proud to say that a lot of times people will read a piece without even looking at my byline. They know it's something that I wrote, because I feel like the voice carries through. I make all of my pieces kind of start with some kind of sense. So you either smell something with me, you feel something with me. There's like some sort of emotional reaction that happens in the beginning, and then the actual interview happens or whatever else, and I interview different people depending on what the topic is. And then usually what I'll do is I'll end it with kind of an action, sort of call to action, where I ask someone to either go on a website, for example, because now I work for a newspaper, so we do something like that at the very end. But it also is really important for me to trust the reader, and not to assume that people don't know things. So I write for, you know, like I said, the former young girl that I used to be. And I also write for whatever audience that publication is for. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. So you can't just pretend like, you don't just write for it's not like you're writing for yourself. You're writing for a certain audience. And that's your editor, the publication, that type of thing. So I have to keep that in mind.
Do you remember the first piece that you wrote that you thought, all right, after this piece, I'm a different type of writer? Was it, I mean, you could call it a breakthrough or an advancement in your writing that you knew that you've grown your skill enough to a point where it's not the same anymore. It's the next level thing.
Yeah, so I went to journalism school, undergrad and grad school. And so I studied it And and I worked in so many different internships and publications, ones you've heard of, ones you've never heard of because they folded, or startups that, I was the editor in chief of this or that, and then that publication, folds after a few months or what. So I've done a very varied type of, I'm a very well-rounded journalist in that sense. I worked as a writer, as an editor, a copy editor, a fact checker. I've done every little part of journalism, every component. In fact, I even went to school, like a summer abroad program, where I learned how to do the design, like the layouts, because I wanted to know how to do everything. I studied photojournalism because I wanted to know how the photographer and the videographer, like I did literally every single part of it because I wanted to be very well rounded. I wanted to know that when I ask my videographer to do something, that it's something practical and that's something that I can realistically ask them to do. So I don't know, what was your question again?
If you remember a journalism piece that you wrote that defined your growth moment.
So I think it was not like one specific thing, but I'll tell you the moment where everything changed. When I started to write personal essays. So that was something that wasn't necessarily part of my aspiration as a journalist. I started out, like I said, in print. I'm a print girl. I'm very traditional, very old school. All of my articles start with a notebook, like I said, and a pen. Like this is how it starts. Whether I'm writing for the New York Times or I'm writing for, a publication that just launched yesterday, I always start with a notebook, and I like to kind of have my words sort of decide for me what's important and what's not, because my hand moves and I find myself crossing things out. If I dig a little deeper into the page, that means this is more important. It evoked an emotion to me. So to me, this is something that I need to kind of keep in mind. So I started out, like I said, very traditional journalism, but there was an opportunity for me to write a personal essay. An editor came to me. It was when women weren't yet allowed to drive, and I had met her um, in yeah, it's a long story, but anyways, I met her and we had a conversation, and she said to me like, I write about the Middle East, whatever else, and she's not non Arab, and I said to her, okay, well, next time you have a story about whatever, just drop me a note and I'll see if I can help you in any kind of way. Anyways, she sends me an email saying I'm writing a story about the Saudi women driving situation. This was way back in the day. I don't even remember what year it was. And then I wrote back an email. Literally was an email. I click reply, and I start explaining my emotional kind of reaction to certain things and what I was just an email. And then she writes back saying, hey, do you mind if I forward this to an editor? We want to publish this as an essay. And I was like, what? It was just an email. And I'm like, okay, sure. If an editor wants it, like we can talk about it. Why not? And that editor responded saying yes. And this is the contract. If you want, we'll pay you this amount of money, and do you want to go for it? And I said, yes. And that changed everything, because once that was published, it was through my perspective and my voice. And I'm not kidding you. What was published was very similar to what I wrote in the email. The editor only asked me to clarify one part, or like to expand on one part. But literally, what is published is what I wrote in the email to her at like 3 a.m. or whatever it was. So that started something very important. And I'll tell you why. I got so many messages from so many people telling me that they read that. And it was the first time that they were able to see it through a perspective from a Saudi woman and not just someone else. And I really give props to that editor, because she knew this wasn't her story to tell. She knew when to step back and be like, that's not my story. Let someone else tell it. And it was intimidating to me because I don't write that type of style. I was a journalist, so I would go out reporting. So I wasn't talking about myself. I was not the story, and I knew this. Even though my story can be a bit more unique, maybe than some others, but I'm never the story. I'm there to tell other people's stories. So that changed everything. So to me, it wasn't necessarily the moment in which anything changed, but I feel like my audience changed. I feel like people were reading that essay and it resonated with people. Either they loved it or they had strong emotional reaction that was maybe not more negative, but it created this energy that wasn't kind of obvious in my regular reporting. So for me, that was a huge shift.
I think about that a lot, not only when it comes to publication or writing stories, but how much do you share of yourself online? And people tend
Yeah.
to appreciate that, right? Tend to appreciate when people get vulnerable, but it's also there is like a danger to that. And I wonder how much do you think about that, and what do you think about like how much do you put yourself out there for the sake of the publication?
Yeah, no, that's a great story. That's something that I think about constantly. A few years ago, Pen America uh, did a study, and they actually kind of asked me some questions about that. I got cyberbullied quite strongly after that because some people just didn't like the piece. And when I read their comments, it wasn't so much they didn't like it; it was just they had emotional reactions to the topic, the guardianship, the women driving, that type of thing, and they would project some of their own emotional reactions, and they would kind of, I was an easy target. I was just low hanging fruit. They could just kind of do that, and I was very accessible. They could contact me directly, and that was something that created friction in me. And I started to think twice before writing anything like that. And like I said, my style of writing was not essays or personal essays. It was more journalism, reporting. And so that was just, I was shocked at how the reactions were so strong when I wrote like hundreds of articles that no one really cared much about. And then that one piece, people like went, really, it went viral. And so after that, I started to become more cautious. And I knew that it was a responsibility. It was very good to kind of say things in my own words, my own perspective. I'm glad that it happened. Could I have done it a little differently? Yes, I probably could have. And I think my editors, we all learned a lot of lessons through that. So I don't regret it, but it's something that we have to go through. It made me a stronger writer, a stronger person, and a stronger journalist. And so I think it was a necessary thing. I think personal essays are still important. And I think the first person kind of perspective is very powerful because it really is, storytelling is very personal. And I think that the more you put yourself out there, the more people can relate to certain things. But it's also important to be mindful that you're not the story. As a journalist, you're not the story. It's not about you. Put your ego aside and try to think of it from a larger perspective. The only reason I use my voice is for as a vehicle for something that, like, I'm in an environment where other people weren't able to be there, and that's the only reason I use my voice in that way. But it's important also to not get that kind of twisted in your mind. So I consider myself to be a journalist. Those personal essays, I write a few here and there, but I prefer um, to write just straight up journalism.
And when you write a journalism piece, and you mentioned storytelling, when you write a journalism piece, and after you're done, what do you think the aspects that make it a successful piece? Whether it's the story or the structure, are there things that you look for before you submit it for publication?
Yeah, I mean, it's always important for us as journalists to remember why you're writing something. Why are you writing it? That's something that I think not enough writers ask themselves, that why are you writing this piece? So what's the point of it? Who's your audience, like we talked about before, but also what's the purpose? Is it necessary? And I think that we need to kind of keep in mind there's so much oversaturation in the news. There's way too much information out there. So you don't need to add more clutter to the digital world. Um, and even the print world, I still work in print. But I think that our goal is not to necessarily satisfy the sources. So you're not necessarily writing something that you want them to love it, because you're not working in PR. This is not public relations. This is journalism. But it's important for you to be accurate. It's important for you to be kind of have integrity with how you're doing it. Don't contact someone under false kind of, don't promise them anything necessarily. Don't pretend like you have this authority that you don't necessarily have. I think it's important that for me, whenever I interview anyone for a story, I tell them this is a collaboration. So I'm writing this piece, but I want you to also brainstorm with me. This is the way that I'm choosing to approach it. What do you think? They're the experts in this subject matter that I'm asking them about. So they're the ones that will tell me whether I got it kind of, I'm hitting, the nail on the head, or if I completely miss the mark. Um, they're the ones that are in the know. So I think that it's important to listen to them, but also not to just, you're not there just to, just transcribe everything that they're saying. That's not the job of a journalist. The job of a journalist is what I told you I did when I was very, very young, which is to take the information that's in front of you, verify it, fact check it, and also find a way to make it kind of um, enjoyable for you as a writer, so that you can convey it accurately and with integrity. I think that's really important. So it's, for me, I've been a journalist now for a very long time, for decades now. So I know before I start writing, how many words is it going to be, who's my editor, which section is it going to be. So sometimes I write for the lifestyle section, for example. So if I'm writing for lifestyle, I actually change the way that I write it a little bit. If I'm writing for the local section, I can change, I tweak it a bit. If I'm writing for the business section, I tweak it, you know what I mean? And before I start writing, I know how many words is it going to be. So I think that's something that comes with experience. So a 400 word piece will be different from if I have a 2,000 word kind of space. So I need to kind of, from the beginning, before I start writing, I think about those things. And oftentimes now I can kind of figure it out. It's not magic, it's just experience. So I'll tell my editor, I think this will be 1,200 words. And usually I hit it around that range. And sometimes I tell them, it's going to be a short piece, which is like 200, 300, 400 words. For me, short pieces are like under 500. I say that, but I usually go longer. I'm a feature writer. I have my master's degree in feature writing. So I actually specialize in long form. So I prefer those.
I want to dig a little bit deeper to the tweaking part because I think is an important one, not only for journalists, but for many writers, even if you're writing, whether you're writing for adults, for teens, or kids, that tweaking has to happen. I'm wondering
Mhm.
when you're making that tweaks, like, and it comes from experience. But what is it? Is it like the tone, the pace, a combination of like few things? Can you put your finger on it, or is it like an experience, a feeling thing?
Yeah, I actually think I have a good sense of, so I don't know if this is annoying or not, but when I'm with people, if I'm writing a piece about like an event, for example, if I'm covering an event, while it's happening, I in my mind, I'm already writing in my head, even if I'm not writing, but I'm like thinking, okay, this is gonna be my lead, this is gonna be my kicker, this is gonna be, like I start to like pick things out while it's happening. And you know how like have you ever watched what is that movie called? The Beautiful Mind, where like things are like kind of swimming, like words are swimming around. Like this is how I feel like my mind operates when I'm writing. When I'm in that event, I can see things and I can feel like, okay, this is going to be like my kicker, which is the conclusion, like how I'm going to end the piece. This is going to be my lead, just how I'm starting it. And it does make a difference if I know this is going to be for the business section, for example, because the business editor doesn't like it when I do all these like flowery artistic kind of references. So I have to kind of get to the point a little bit faster. I have to kind of go you know. But if I'm writing for lifestyle, I have more luxury to like describe how it smells and how it feels, and but if it's business, I have to go straight kind of it has to be so I have to kind of adjust myself depending on the section and who the editor is. And I learned before I start writing anything, I have to know who my editor is. It's actually really important to me who my editor is and which section it's going to be in, because then I can actually not waste my time or their time. And of course, sometimes it changes. So while I'm writing something, they give this to another section or whatever else, and it happens. But mostly, I try to kind of customize it for that section or that publication. So you asked me a great question about whether the audience is maybe younger or a little bit older. I think even the younger audience, we don't want to you know, we want to give them credit. We have to trust the reader and trust their intelligence and their kind of young people today are super intelligent. They're so smart and they understand things. So I feel like we shouldn't dumb things down. I think that's the most respectful thing to do, is just give the subject matter the integrity it deserves. And yeah, the editor will help you kind of adjust it if you kind of really are off. But I think most of the time, I pride myself in giving clean copies. A lot of my pieces, my copy editors, because I used to be a copy editor, so they seem to really enjoy my pieces in the sense that they don't have too many kind of errors to kind of adjust. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's something that you develop with practice.
I appreciate that. I was wondering because you mentioned the word integrity a few times. When you're doing your research on a piece, where do you start? Is it like a Wikipedia page and then you go deeper into more reliable sources, or you have a different starting point?
So for me, I really enjoy stories that are off the beaten path a little bit. So stories that are not super well established, because if it's something that when you Google it, there's a lot of hits, to me, it's halas, like other people have already done it. Like, what are you going to do to improve on it or change on it to make it different, make it your own? So I'm always attracted to, remember we talked about challenges a little bit? Like, I'm always attracted to things that are a little bit more interesting for me. So if I do interview someone who's maybe like quote unquote famous, I have to find an angle to it or something that's different, that's unique, that other people wouldn't have access to. So I actually stay away from interviewing anyone that's like super famous or celebrities. I try not to do those stories because it's been done. I have so many peers in the journalism world that have done great jobs interviewing them. So why should I kind of jump in on that? I'm a long form writer. As I said, I'm a feature writer. So I like to spend time with people. And so what I like to do is, first of all, just do a quick search, just, basic search. It doesn't necessarily mean Wikipedia, just basic search. It could be their Twitter account. It could be, social media, or it could be if they have a website or anything that kind of comes up. And then we just have a conversation, human to human. I think that most of my stories come from just interactions with people. I don't really do a lot of stories out of a press release, for example. A lot of my stories are like people that I interact with. So I'll give you a story. I'll give you an example of a story. So I was interviewing someone. I was waiting to interview someone for something. It was a technology story, and I write a lot about tech as well. And I was waiting to interview someone who was in a different room, and they told me that he's in a meeting. Just wait a couple of minutes. And I said, "Oh, okay, sure." So I sit down and I'm just waiting, and there was a person that just happened to hover around, he just happened to be there. And I don't know what he was waiting for or what, we just started talking. I don't even know who talked to who, we just started talking. And it was just about like the coffee that they offered, like they had the free coffee or whatever. We just started talking about something silly. And then we just got to talking. And then he said to me like, "Oh, like, what are you here for?" or something. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm waiting to interview so-and-so." And it turns out he was like the president of the Saudi Rugby Federation. And I was like, "Oh my God, what are you like, can I write a story about you and about rugby in Saudi?" And he was like, "Sure." And I was like, "Okay, let's do it." And so that's how it started. And I interviewed him. I talked to the sports editor. He's like, "Go for it." And I did two stories about rugby. purely based on talking to someone while wasting time. And it was great that this person was late. His meeting went, overtime. So I was able to have this conversation with someone, and he had no press. Nobody had interviewed him before. So it was the first time that anyone interviewed him for a story. And so it was really cool for me, and I got to be in the sports section. So that was cool.
That is amazing. The way, I don't even, maybe that's not something that I totally believe in, but like how random interactions, random events can come together and steer you to a particular way. I feel like it's just part
Yeah.
of like a bigger plan. Yeah, that is amazing.
Yeah, it was so cool. I mean, most of my stories that come from something like that, where I just meet someone randomly, and then it turns out this person that I had a really great conversation with about, the lukewarm coffee that was being served at this conference or whatever. It turned into something else, and we ended up writing several stories together. So yeah, it's something that is important as a journalist to not limit yourself to what is in the press release that's being sent to you or what your editor assigns to you. I think you need to go get stories. You need to be curious. You need to be in your community and talk to people. Listen. What's important also is to listen. You have to listen. You have to be a very good listener as a journalist. You have to listen to what people are saying, what people are thinking about out loud, so that you can, fill those gaps. The things that people are talking about. I love going to cafes and listening to the old ladies talk because what they're complaining about is a legitimate problem. Whatever they're complaining about, it doesn't matter what it is. That's a story, whatever that is. And I'll tell you, a lot of stories that I've done in my career are from listening to people talk, and I just interrupt them, be like, excuse me, I overheard you talk about this. And this is how a lot of my stories, I could go back into all of my stories and tell you how I kind of came up with all of those. Most of them have not been assigned to me. I assign them I pitch them to my editor because of things like that. Because if you really care about telling the stories in your community, you'll find amazing things that no one else has written about. That's a given. You can fill in so many gaps that other reporters maybe take it more literally, and that's fine. There's no shame in that. But that's not my approach. I get bored, and I don't want to do the story that everyone else is doing. So that's just my style and my tip.
Yeah, that's an amazing tip and style to just sit at cafes and listen to people. Definitely a thing to do. I wanted to ask you about every writer needs a community of writers, of artistic people who feed them energy, ideas, and who sort of be companions in the endeavor that they are in. I'm wondering, how did you find yours, and was it hard, easy, and how to maintain it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think community is important, and you can find it in different ways. Like I said, I just go out into my community, and I would just go to cafes, I go to events. People recognize me. At some point, they started to kind of be like, oh, it's nice to see you again, that type of thing. What's also really important, and maybe this is not what you might think I would maybe say, but a lot of the close people in my life are not journalists. They're not in the journalism world, and so I think it's really grounding to me. A lot of my close friends, like, are doctors, like engineers, like different professions. First of all, it's very humbling because they don't care about the stuff that I'm like, my tweet went viral, and they don't care. It doesn't matter. They're like, I saved a life today. Well, they don't say that, but like my doctor friends, like they do other things, and so they have very different lifestyles than I do. And what's important for me also is to stay grounded in that sense, and also to understand their perspectives and their stories and the things that they're excited about, they're interested in. But yeah, I do have a community of people that I kind of go to. There are some very trusted people that are culture writers that I kind of will brainstorm ideas. And, it's maybe so nerdy, but we'll send each other articles and be like, how we would approach it differently if we were the ones writing it. And so it's actually really interesting. It's like kind of a puzzle that, you're like, oh, I think it might be better from this angle, if you stand that side, or whatever. And it's It's an ever-changing thing. I mean, like I said, I lived in different countries, different places. Each time I have to rebuild the community, in the local community, but also don't forget the people from my digital community. They're also with me wherever I go. They're with me, and it's important for you to check in on them, to comment on the works that you read. Like if I read my colleague and she writes a great piece, or he writes a great piece, I'll message them and be like, "Hey, I loved your piece about this and that." I think it's important to engage. So you need to also kind of give in, be a good community person, like read their work, be part of their community, in the sense like if they have a talk on a panel, go to that talk if you can. Just attend the talk and sit down in the audience and clap for them. It's important to kind of show up, and I think that's something that um, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, but I think if you really are in it for the right reasons, it's a pleasure. You want to be there to support their work. You want to be there to support them, and they'll also be there to support you in their own ways. So I think that's important, to be a good community person.
I appreciate that. And it's funny that you mentioned that all of your friends or most of your friends are doctors and engineers. Literally, all of my friends are doctors and engineers, and I actually had a very tough time. And the uni community in the U.S. have not like broke through the arts as much. We're still like business oriented. The first generation is still seeping through
Yeah.
the education sector, so it's only a few of us that have made it out of like the business sphere. And um, not to like bring down the businesses that we open. I think they're doing great. It just the flexibility is not there yet. So me growing up wanting to be a writer or deciding to be a writer, like it was a nightmare. It wasn't something that was welcomed. But then my friends were like surprised about it. Like, you write, and especially an immigrant who writes, it's like, is not
Yeah.
this is not even your first language.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I think that it's important for us to kind of be there for each other in the best way that we can. And one of the ways is you approached me. You wanted me to be a guest on this podcast, and I'm more than happy to, because I feel like that's being a good community person. To kind of be there for other people, be part of their worlds, and engage in the content that they're creating, and being genuine about it. Like, be curious about what people are doing, and I think that will open up so many doors and windows, and it helps everyone overall. Growing up in Saudi, like I said, especially women, we weren't really encouraged to do this type of work that I'm doing. So, you just carve your own path and hope for the best.
I wanna end at a happier note than the one we are in right now.
Okay.
What do you hope readers, or what emotion do you hope readers get from your writing, from your journalism?
So I really hope that the topics I'm choosing to kind of focus on resonate. So the topics that I write about, it varies. It's a wide kind of range. I primarily work in art and culture, but I also do a very wide variety of different pieces. And I just want to make sure that the pieces that I write are accurate, they resonate in some sort of way. It should make you feel some kind of emotion. It could be it doesn't have to be positive all the time, but it has to evoke something. I don't want people to read it and just be passive about it. I want people to care. And I think that's who my primary audience is. I don't write short pieces mostly. I write long form. So I recognize I already eliminate a wide range of readers from that, because I don't write short pieces necessarily. But I think that if you just write from the heart, and you have the intention to inform and educate, and just be part of the larger story, and amplify those narratives and voices that haven't been in the news in the way that it should be, I think that's all you can hope for. So I don't know. I mean, there isn't a clear answer to that necessarily. It's something that happens with time and just being part of the community, I think. I don't know.
I ask all my guests this question.
Okay.
If there's a writer, it can be a journalist, alive or dead, that you can meet and have dinner with, who would it be?
I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. I would love to have dinner with my younger self. And I really do, because I feel like there was so much um, passion that little heart had, and so much emotion in my fingers and the ink that I was holding in my finger. And I knew the power of it. And I wanted to kind of convey that. And I just didn't know how. And now that I have the tools, the resources, the ability, I would love to kind of have dinner with my younger self and just, I don't know if this is like a egotistical answer or not, but to me, it's something that I think with years of discovering myself and my voice, I realized that that little girl became a writer because I felt that the words I would say out loud, no one would listen to them. So I would write because I knew that if I wrote it on the page wouldn't reject whatever I had to say. So I needed to kind of keep writing. And I feel like now I have that confidence, the tools, and the ability. And so I would love to kind of go back and have dinner with my former self.
What advice would you give your younger self in that dinner table?
Just keep the quirky stories that you were interested in. People will care about them too. Those little things that, you know, were exciting and interesting to you, people will care about it eventually. And I think that I was trying to, like earlier on, I told you I was imitating the writers that I was reading, but I developed my own style. And, you know, something really exciting and interesting is that there's some professors that teach writing classes, and my articles are part of the curriculum. So now I'm homework. People have to read my work as part of their studies. And I've been privileged to be a guest speaker at some of those kind of classes. And those students would ask me questions, and it's just like it's such a thrill. So yeah, that's I think one of my biggest accomplishments is I was able to do that.
Yeah, congrats. That is an amazing accomplishment that you should be proud of. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, I'm available online. You can search for my name, and my email is right there. My email is publicly available. I make sure that it's there on all of my social media accounts. My email is there because I don't want anyone to have the excuse that they weren't able to reach a Saudi woman, for example, for anything. That's something that I would hear over and over, especially when I worked in New York City for a number of years. People would tell me, "Oh, we didn't find a Saudi to talk to." And I'm like, you know what? There's no excuse. Now it's there. And so I want people to reach out. I actually read every single email that I receive. It doesn't mean I'll respond to everything, but I do take the time, because I used to be that person who would email people that I really was interested in their writing. And I would get such a thrill when someone would write back. So I want to be the one to reply if I can.
Well, I will link your social media accounts and website down in the description. Thank
Okay.
you so much, Jasmine, for coming on. Really appreciate you coming to the podcast. This was a thrill
Thank you.
to have you, and I'll definitely have you again at some point, because I felt like
Okay.
I could have taken this conversation in so many different avenues. But for the
Yeah,
meantime,
I really appreciate your curiosity, and thank you so much for making me part of this community as well. So thank you for inviting me here.
thank you so much. That's it for this episode in Hazawi podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and extracted valuable information and lessons to apply in your own life. To make sure you don't miss the next episode, sign up to my newsletter in the link below, where I also share books I'm reading, writing tips, and quotes I'm pondering, and much more cool stuff. And do not forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay creative and salam.